May 2nd, 1945, Berlin city center. The guns had finally fallen silent during the night. Buildings were still collapsing, fires burned in multiple districts, and smoke hung low over streets clogged with rubble. Soviet soldiers moved through the ruined city, setting up checkpoints and posting guards at major intersections, while German civilians emerged cautiously from basements, many holding improvised white flags. German military authority had ceased to exist, but what would replace it was unclear. For the first time in 12 years, Germany had no functioning government, no law, and no certainty about what would happen next. At 8 o'clock that morning, General Helmuth Weidling, commander of Berlin's garrison, signed the instrument of surrender to a Soviet general at Soviet headquarters in Tempelhof. The surrender ended more than 2 weeks of fighting that had reduced much of the capital to rubble. The battle had exacted a devastating toll on both sides. Soviet forces had taken enormous losses in dead and wounded. German military casualties were similarly severe, and civilian losses inside the city ran into the hundreds of thousands. Weidling's signature marked the formal end of organized military resistance in Berlin, but the document had no authority beyond the city itself. Germany as a unified state had effectively ceased to exist days earlier, when Adolf Hitler died on April 30th in his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Hitler had appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor before his death, and Dönitz had established what he called a government at Flensburg near the Danish border. This arrangement, however, controlled no meaningful territory and had no real capacity to administer a country being overrun from multiple directions at once. German forces across Europe were surrendering to Allied armies in scattered groups, creating a confused situation where some units were still fighting while others had already laid down their weapons. For German civilians, particularly those in the Soviet-occupied eastern regions, the question of who governed them had no clear answer beyond the immediate authority of whatever occupying troops had reached their neighborhood. The physical devastation that greeted Berliners emerging from shelters exceeded anything most had imagined possible. Years of Allied bombing had already destroyed large sections of the city, but the final battle had finished the job. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble fields, where streets could no longer be distinguished from former building sites. The Tiergarten Park had become a landscape of craters and shattered trees. The government quarter around the Reichstag was a zone of near-total destruction where Soviet artillery had concentrated its fire during the final assault. The scale of homelessness defied immediate comprehension. Well over 1 million Berlin residents had lost their homes to bombing, artillery fire, or deliberate burning during the last days of fighting. Families who had spent weeks sheltering in basements and bunkers now faced the realization that they had nowhere to go when they emerged. Many simply stayed in the underground spaces they had used during the battle, trying to create makeshift living quarters in damp, unventilated cellars while the ruins of their former apartments loomed overhead. The collapse of infrastructure created immediate crises that dominated every hour of civilian life. Berlin's water system, built over decades to serve a major industrial city, had been gutted by bombing and by the loss of electrical power needed to run pumping stations. Broken water mains flooded some streets, while other areas had no water at all. The Spree River, flowing through the city center, became a last resort source despite obvious contamination from sewage, chemicals, and decomposing bodies that had not yet been recovered. German civilians learned quickly that water now required hours of daily effort to obtain. Those who lived near a functioning hydrant or a damaged main that still produced flow queued for hours with whatever containers they could find, carrying buckets and pots through streets blocked by debris. Others walked to the river or to bomb craters filled with groundwater, knowing the water might be unsafe but having no alternative. Soviet units set up field kitchens in various locations, and these became focal points where German civilians could sometimes get water and thin soup, but access was uncertain and meant standing in long lines with no guarantee of receiving anything. Food presented an even more desperate challenge because the entire system that had fed Berlin had stopped working. The city had never been self-sufficient in food production and normally relied on surrounding regions for almost all of its supply. Those agricultural areas had been devastated by fighting, occupied by Soviet forces who requisitioned whatever remained, or cut off from Berlin by the destruction of rail lines and roads. The warehouses, distribution centers, and ration offices that had managed food during the war disappeared along with the government that ran them. German civilians who had endured years of rationing now faced the prospect of real starvation. The rations that Soviet authorities initially provided to German civilians in their sector amounted to roughly half of what a person needed to maintain basic health. In theory, displaced persons from other European countries received higher ration rations through Allied imports and relief agencies. But even these figures meant little on the ground, where distribution was chaotic and supplies irregular. Many Berliners received less than they were supposed to get. People began a daily search for anything edible, sifting through rubble for overlooked stocks, picking through garbage, catching and eating cats, dogs, and rats, and gathering wild plants growing among the ruins. The shortage of shelter created conditions that would have been unimaginable in Berlin only weeks earlier. A city that had been one of Europe's major capitals now housed much of its surviving population in basements with poor ventilation, no sanitation, and questionable structural integrity. Families crowded into cellars that might collapse without warning, sharing space with strangers because any habitable shelter had become precious. The U-Bahn tunnels that had served as emergency shelters during the final battle continued to house thousands who had nowhere else to go, living in the dark amid the smell of human waste and the constant risk of flooding from broken mains. Those who still had partially standing buildings faced the constant danger of collapse. Artillery and bombing had weakened countless structures that looked intact from the outside, but whose internal supports were badly damaged. Walls could give way, floors could suddenly drop, and entire buildings sometimes pancaked down, level by level, in the days after the fighting ended. People trying to salvage possessions from damaged apartments risked their lives each time they climbed unstable staircases or walked across questionable floors. With no organized inspections or demolition efforts yet in place, these hazards would persist for weeks. The complete breakdown of civil order meant traditional ideas of law and property lost their meaning. German police had either fled, been taken prisoner, or simply stopped functioning when the government collapsed. Soviet forces imposed their own military law, but enforcement was inconsistent and aimed mainly at preventing any German military reorganization, not at protecting civilians from violence or theft. Personal safety depended on chance, on the behavior of the particular units in control of an area, and on whether an individual happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Looting became widespread as both Soviet soldiers and desperate German civilians took what they could from damaged homes, shops, and warehouses. Many Soviet troops had fought their way through devastated Soviet cities and had seen their own homes destroyed. They showed little interest in respecting German property. Watches, jewelry, clothing, alcohol, and anything with obvious value vanished quickly. German civilians who tried to defend what remained could face serious consequences if they resisted Soviet soldiers, but those who stayed passive watched years of possessions disappear in a matter of hours. The collapse of currency added another layer to the chaos. The Reichsmark rapidly lost meaning as people stopped believing any paper money issued by a defunct government had value. A barter economy emerged almost immediately. Cigarettes, alcohol, bread, and other tangible goods replaced money as the medium of exchange. A black market began to form, still disorganized but growing fast. People traded family heirlooms, tools, and clothing for food. Farmers from outlying areas, when they dared to enter the Yokito city, could demand and receive very high prices in goods from starving Berliners. The violence that accompanied Soviet occupation fell especially heavily on German women. Many Soviet soldiers, remembering the destruction of their own homes and the atrocities committed by German forces in the Soviet Union, arrived in Germany with a desire for revenge. This often took the form of sexual violence on a massive scale. In Berlin alone, later estimates suggest that tens of thousands of girls and women were assaulted during the occupation period, with the worst wave in the first weeks after the city's fall. German women learned to hide during evening and night hours when Soviet troops were most likely to be drinking and searching buildings, and to move only at times when soldiers were more likely to be asleep or on duty. Soviet forces also carried out summary actions against suspected SS members and Nazi officials. Sometimes these were based on legitimate identification. Other times they came from denunciations by German civilians trying to settle personal scores. Without any functioning judicial system, accusations often led directly to punishment without investigation or trial. Germans who had opposed the regime and those who had supported it found themselves in the same desperate conditions, because for many Soviet units there was little distinction between different categories of German civilians. The roads leading west from Berlin and from other Eastern German cities became crowded with people attempting to flee the Soviet advance. This movement had begun months earlier, but it grew rapidly in the last weeks of the war and continued even after Berlin itself fell. Over the broader period of 1944 to 1950, many millions of ethnic Germans would be driven from or forced to leave territories in the East. In the spring and early summer of 1945, the heaviest streams of refugees were on the move. They carried what they could on foot, in carts, or in the few vehicles that still ran, trying to reach areas expected to fall under American or British control rather than Soviet occupation. These refugee columns moved alongside another huge flow of people traveling in the opposite direction, former forced laborers from other European countries who had been compelled to work in German factories, farms, and workshops during the war. There were millions of these displaced persons. Many had endured harsh conditions and abuse, and some expressed their anger by attacking German civilians or looting German property as they tried to make their way home. The competing movements of refugees and returning laborers created a humanitarian crisis that overwhelmed any existing relief system. Thousands of children were separated from their parents in the confusion of the final weeks of fighting and the immediate aftermath. Some had been evacuated earlier from cities and now could not find parents who had fled or died. Others had lost parents in air raids, street fighting, or arrests by occupying forces. These children wandered the ruins looking for relatives, formed small groups to survive, or attached themselves to adults who seemed willing to provide food and shelter. Agencies that might once have cared for them had collapsed along with the rest of the German state. Soviet authorities and later Western Allied military governments faced a scale of child abandonment and displacement that far exceeded their capacity to respond. The psychological impact of total defeat was profound. Many Germans later described their mental state in these days as shock or numbness. 12 years of Nazi propaganda had promised final victory or glorious downfall, but it had never prepared people for complete military collapse, foreign occupation, and the public exposure of crimes committed in Germany's name. Those who had believed in the regime saw their worldview shattered. Those who had opposed it found no comfort in defeat because occupation and suffering fell on everyone, regardless of political attitude. The phrase Stunde Null, or Hour Zero, captured the sense that everything familiar had ended and that the future would be unlike anything they had known. Uncertainty about legal status and citizenship added to the anxiety. With the German state dissolved and no functioning German government, people wondered what it meant to be a German citizen and who, if anyone, now recognized that status. Who could issue identity papers? Who could legitimize marriages, record births and deaths, or certify property ownership? The documents that had ordered German administrative life suddenly meant very little. Yet people still needed proof of who they were and what they owned to navigate everyday situations. The occupation authorities would eventually create new systems, but during this first week, those systems did not exist. The experience of German civilians differed greatly depending on where they lived. Those in areas that would later become the Western occupation zones faced a different path than those in what became the Soviet zone, though this boundary was not yet clearly defined in early May. Germans who saw American, British, or French troops approaching generally expected somewhat better treatment, reinforced by propaganda that had portrayed Western powers as more civilized than the Soviets. Often, they did receive more structured and predictable treatment, though occupation still brought hardship. Germans in the East faced both the immediate violence and requisitions of early Soviet control and the beginning of a different political and social order that would eventually form the basis of a separate state. Rural areas had usually avoided the scale of physical destruction seen in cities, but they too felt the collapse of government and the arrival of foreign troops. Farmers faced demands for livestock, grain, and equipment from armies that needed to feed themselves. Villages waited for news of men who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht, trying to determine who was dead, who was a prisoner, and who was simply missing. The agricultural economy, which had continued functioning even in the late stages of the war, now confronted a situation where markets were gone, money was worthless, and occupation authorities had shifting and sometimes contradictory policies. In the days after May 2nd, Germany's military situation became clearer, even as civilian life remained chaotic. Surrenders continued across the continent. On May 4th, German forces in northwest Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark surrendered to British command. On May 7th, at Allied headquarters in Rams, a German delegation signed a surrender document covering all remaining forces, with hostilities to cease the following day. On May 8th, another signing ceremony took place in Berlin, this time before representatives of the main Allied powers. Because of time zone differences, the formal end of fighting was marked on May 8th in the West and May 9th in the Soviet Union. For Germans, however, May 8th brought no scenes like those in London, Paris, Moscow, or New York. The end of fighting meant only that the shooting had stopped. It did not mean the end of hunger, homelessness, or fear. The immediate priorities remained the same: find water, find food, find shelter, and survive each day in a country that no longer existed as a functioning state. Allied military government units began arriving in their assigned zones during this time, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the scale of the problems. One senior British commander later described facing millions of prisoners of war, vast numbers of wounded soldiers, enormous flows of refugees and displaced persons, no working transport or communications, industry and agriculture at a standstill, and an immediate risk of widespread starvation and disease. He admitted that nothing in his military training had prepared him for such a situation. The early occupation directives reflected a mix of humanitarian concern and punitive intent. Allied leaders wanted to prevent epidemics and mass starvation, but they also believed that Germany had to face consequences for the war it had started. American policy instructions, for example, emphasized that Germany was a defeated enemy and that Germans should be made to understand that their own actions had brought about destruction and suffering. These directives limited the extent to which occupation authorities were allowed to promote rapid economic recovery or provide extensive assistance to the German population. As a result, occupation officials in the first week often operated without clear, practical guidance on whether to prioritize relief or strict control. Individual commanders made choices based on their own judgment and on local circumstances, leading to considerable variation between regions. Some units began organizing soup kitchens and distributing emergency rations as soon as possible. Others focused on security, enforced non-fraternization rules, and discouraged or forbade soldiers from sharing food with German civilians, even when those civilians were obviously starving. The administrative vacuum also opened space for some Germans to begin organizing local survival efforts. In some towns and cities, former officials who could plausibly claim not to have been active Nazis approached occupation authorities and offered to help restore basic services. Where Allied commanders accepted their help, limited local administrations began to reform under military supervision. Elsewhere, occupation forces kept direct control and blocked any German attempts at organized activity. These early choices would shape how different regions experienced occupation, reconstruction, and political change in the years that followed. German civilians confronting the ruins of their cities began clearing rubble, not because anyone ordered them to, but because they needed passable paths and because doing something concrete helped counter the feeling of helplessness. Women, who now made up a large majority of the adult population in many cities due to male casualties and imprisonment, formed the core of these efforts. They carried bricks, cleared debris by hand, and tried to reclaim usable materials from the wreckage. The figure of the Trümmerfrau, the rubble woman, would later become a symbol of this period, though in this first week, the work was uncoordinated and only scratched the surface of what needed to be done. The week between May 2nd and May 9th marked a transitional moment in German history. The Nazi state had collapsed, but the new order that would replace it had not yet taken shape. Germany existed as a geographic space filled with people trying to survive under conditions that barely fit within a normal definition of civilized life. Institutions that had structured German society for generations, government ministries, courts, schools, welfare agencies, major corporations, had either vanished or were no longer functioning. For many Germans, this week felt both endlessly long and strangely compressed. Each day brought new threats and difficulties that made time drag, yet later, memories often blurred the days together into a single stretch of confusion and trauma. People frequently could not recall whether a particular event had happened on May 3rd, May 5th, or May 7th. With normal routines gone, clocks and calendars destroyed or irrelevant, and survival occupying every waking moment, conventional timekeeping lost its meaning. Patterns formed during these first days would shape German life for years. The emerging division between regions under Western and Soviet control would harden into the border between two German states. The early relationships between occupiers and civilians would influence how denazification, reconstruction, and political reforms played out. The survival strategies Germans developed, reliance on barter, informal networks, and improvised community structures, would evolve into the black market and gray zones of authority that characterized the immediate post-war period. The week when Berlin fell and Germany stopped functioning as a state marked the beginning of the country's transformation, But at the time, almost no one could see beyond the next day. The suffering Germans endured in this week cannot be separated from the broader context of German responsibility for the war and its crimes. German forces had brought similar devastation to cities across Europe, had deliberately starved populations, and had carried out systematic mass murder on a scale without precedent. The Holocaust, the deaths of millions of Soviet prisoners, brutal occupation policies, and the plunder of occupied territories meant that the hunger, homelessness, and fear Germans now faced were directly linked to the policies their state had pursued. This does not make individual German suffering unreal, but it places it within a chain of cause and effect. At the same time, those queuing for contaminated water, searching rubble for food, or sleeping in dangerous basements included people who had opposed the regime, people who had been children throughout the Nazi period, and people whose only crime had been passivity or fear. The moral picture of German suffering in May 1945 is therefore complex. It cannot be reduced either to a story of innocent victims or to one of purely deserved punishment. War's consequences fall on entire populations, not only on those who made decisions or carried out orders. The week after Berlin fell marked the beginning of Germany's confrontation with both the physical consequences of total defeat and the moral reckoning that would shape its identity for generations. In later years, debates about guilt or responsibility, memory, and reconstruction would dominate public life. But during those specific days in early May 1945, such discussions lay in the future. For people living through that week, the urgent questions were practical and immediate. Is there water today? Is there anything to eat? Will the building hold? Will my family survive the night? Germany existed in the gap between the end of one historical era and the beginning of another, and daily life consisted of enduring 1 hour after another under conditions that pushed human endurance to its limits.